Hey there, and thanks for joining me for this episode of Speaking of. This is a segment that I do here to dig into an issue that is current or contemporary, an issue that is often maybe political or social in nature. And I want to look at what are some of the principles that shape how we as Christians look at an issue like this. Now, here in the United States, within the next about 4 weeks or so, we are going to the polls. It's midterm elections, and so all across the country, people will be getting ready to cast their ballots for a whole lot of different candidates for all kinds of different offices, both state and federal. And one of the big issues that will be on the ballot, or at least indirectly on the ballot, is the issue of abortion. Now, indirectly means that there's not actually anything that citizens will vote on whether or not to legalize abortion, but they will be voting for candidates, and those candidates, their stance on the issue of abortion is going to be very important for this particular election, probably more so than any time in recent history. And why is that? Why is this such an issue today? That's what I want to look at, and then I want to give some principles that I think should shape us as Christians. How do we as Christians look and think about the issue of abortion? Now, why is this an issue today? In the 1990s, President Bill Clinton became rather well known for his stance on abortion, in which he, and then later on Hillary Clinton as well, said that abortion should be safe and legal and rare. And in doing that, he was really trying to strike a somewhat moderate pose. He was trying to hold that tension between those who believed that abortion was something that a woman had the right to obtain if she so desired, but also recognizing that this was not a desirable thing, or at least it was not a good thing, but it was sometimes a necessary evil, if you will. And so he coined that phrase, safe, legal, and rare, to describe what he thought would be the appropriate stance on abortion. Hillary Clinton as well, when she campaigned in 2008, she picked that up and she endorsed that perspective in 2008. And so for a long time, abortion, since it was legalized in 1973 by the Supreme Court in the famous Roe v. Wade case, abortion, it actually interestingly peaked in about 1990, the number of abortions, and it's been in decline ever since. At least the trend has been downward. But Bill Clinton and the Clintons coined that phrase to sort of hold some middle ground. But what has happened since 2000, really since I think arguably since 2008, when Hillary Clinton campaigned and still upheld that position, the people on the political left, typically the Democrats, have moved very, very far left of their historic and their traditional position. And what happened, and this is a little bit of my own editorial comment, I think, is what happens is when you get one group moving to one extreme, the other group moves to the opposite extreme. And so there's been this polarizing effect on lots of issues, but in particular on this issue. And so in the time since then, the United States has developed the most, since the 2000s, the United States has had some of the most permissive and progressive policies on abortion anywhere in the world. The United States is one of, I think, 7 countries that up until very recently had permitted abortion even after 20 weeks of pregnancy. And so even in the 2018, 19, somewhere in there, when they last had numbers available for abortions, the number, and it depends on who you ask, because there's really 2 main sources that statistics come from the CDC or from the Guttmacher Institute. The CDC is a government-funded organization, and the Guttmacher is a privately funded but well-respected organization that studies and advocates for reproductive rights. Both of those organizations compile data differently. They use different methods, and so their numbers, actually there's a fair bit of variance in the numbers, but a conservative estimate would say that about between 600 and 900,000 abortions, 600 and 900,000 abortions were performed each year, roughly, give or take a little bit. That's an awful lot of abortions, and that is down from the peak in the early 1990s. I think it was 1990. That was the peak year, and there were over 1 million abortions being performed per year at a conservative estimate. So we've seen culturally, we've seen this progression that has moved increasingly to the left, from safe, legal, and rare to, in 2012, it was advocated safe, legal, and free, which was a way of, I forget the politician who said it, anyway, it doesn't really matter, but she advocated for safe, legal, and regardless of one's ability to pay. And so the idea was that abortion should be available to anyone who wants it. It should not be, there should be very few restrictions. And so even the most stringent abortion advocacy groups have really rejected the historic platform, safe, legal, and rare, and they've moved to safe, legal, and free. And so there's been this massive increase. Now, as a result of this, so you get this progression to the left, and as well, you get a polarizing effect. You get people on the right who move to opposing abortion, and that becomes very much a part of the Republican platform. So and this is a little bit of a simplification, but one of the things then that Trump campaigned on, and one of the things that he promised, would be to appoint justices that would oppose abortion. And indeed, that's exactly what he did. In June of this year, June of 2022, a decision was made. Now, it's really, I think the details are important here. The Supreme Court decision did not outlaw abortion. That's not what the decision did. What the decision did was that it actually stated that Roe v. Wade in 1973 was overreach of the U.S. Supreme Court. The decision in 2022 said that the Supreme Court did not have the authority to grant to make the ruling that a fetus was not protected by the United States Constitution. And so effectively what the decision did in June was it said this is really a decision that belongs with the state. It's not something that falls under the purview of the United States Constitution. And so since June, there's been a massive sort of almost a chaotic move toward, in different states, to either outlaw abortion or to protect it. Hence the fact that abortion is a big issue on this particular election, because who is elected in different states will have a big influence on what that state then does with the abortion laws. In my state, in Oregon, we have probably the most permissive abortion laws anywhere in the country. Abortion is granted under just about any condition. Federal funds can be used or have historically been able to be used, and abortion is very well protected. Why? And so before I try to show from a Christian point of view the problems with this, I think it's proper to examine what are the reasons, why are people in favor of abortion. So I think this is part of intellectual honesty, says consider the arguments against your own position. And so I think, so let me start by doing that. Why do people favor freedom to have an abortion? Well, you'll probably get a lot of different reasons. I think there are two big ones. One of them is autonomy. Those who favor abortion believe that a person, an individual, should have the right to have a say and have actually complete say over what happens to them physically, to their bodies. And so should they choose to seek a course of medical treatment, they should have the right to do that. And they would include abortion then under medical treatment. And so you should be able to, a person should be able to make decisions that will have dramatic effects on their own health and for that matter, on their own life. I mean, having a child obviously has life-changing implications. And so the argument in favor of abortion says that a person should be able to have the freedom to make those decisions on their own without the government stepping in and telling them that they may not do that. In other words, they would tell you that the government laws against abortion would then make a person have to make decisions or choose a course of life that they do not otherwise want. They're sort of forced into having a child. They're forced into a way of life that they're not ready for, perhaps. And that's maybe the other part of the argument is it says, you know what, having a child is such a major responsibility, and if you want to provide for him, and who's going to take care of this child? A lot of times people who seek an abortion might be lower income. They might be in a situation where the father is probably not going to be in the picture. And so the mother is left to care for this child all alone. And it's an incredibly frightening place to be. And so in a moment like that, an abortion can seem like a better choice, because it's going to ensure that a child is not born into a situation where a mother or a parent of even a mother and a father cannot properly care for that child. What are some of the challenges to this position? And here's where I want to push back against some of the arguments in favor of abortion. One of the things that you find, and it's maybe a little bit of a risky argument, but I've known people who are very adamantly opposed to abortion restrictions. In other words, they support completely a person's right to choose to have an abortion. And yet in other conversations, you find out that they're also staunch defenders of things like animal rights. They would be horrified, for example, if you were to, kill a litter of puppies, just as an example, which is a horrible thing to think about. But the question then becomes, well, why do you support, why would you be in favor of allowing the death of an unborn child, and why would you be so opposed to any form of animal cruelty, right? I think at the root of that is that when it comes to abortion, what has happened is we've had to dehumanize the entire process. In other words, you don't talk about an unborn child, you talk about a fetus. And that's a way of sort of medicalizing the entire process. You reduce it down to, you reduce a fetus, you reduce an unborn child down to a fetus, down to a lump of cells. And then the abortion is simply a medical procedure. It's tissue. You're dealing with tissue. You're not dealing with a human life. And I think that's problematic. I think that raises some difficult questions. Again, there seems to be an inconsistency in the worldview there. There's another there we go. Another couple of problems. One of the refrains that we often hear in this whole discussion is that my body, my choice, which is a way of, again, it articulates that autonomy. And I think there are actually two problems with that, or two challenges. The first is this: when you, and I think you can just break it down by challenging both those assertions, my body and my choice. When you say my body, I think the question you have to ask is that an absolute claim? Does that claim, my body, does that hold true under every circumstance and in every case? So in other words, it's not just your body any longer. If you are pregnant, it's not just your body. You are actually responsible for another body. Like it or not, accept it or not, you now have another life, another human life that is depending on you. And so when you say my body, that's not exactly accurate. You're not telling the full story, because it's also someone else's body. And so you are now responsible for another life. Your autonomy is not complete. It's not absolute. It is also autonomy. It's also responsibility for another life. And the second problem here, I think, is the whole question of choice. When we say my body, my choice, again, the question is, well, is your choice absolute? What about, where does responsibility fit into the picture? Now, I'm going to come back to a related part of this, because of course, pregnancy is not just a woman's issue. Of course, there's a man involved too. And I think there's a glaring lack of responsibility there so often, which is a serious issue. But we have to bear responsibility in most cases. And by the way, I'll throw this out as well, because I'm not addressing cases of rape or incest. I believe that falls under a separate category. And so I think I'll say something about that in a minute. I'm talking about simply a person who becomes pregnant, usually through failure to practice birth control or some other such thing. I believe that we have to accept responsibility for instances like that. When you make choices that could result in pregnancy, then I think you have to be prepared to accept the responsibility for those choices. And even if those choices lead to undesirable outcomes, I think we are still morally responsible to follow through on those choices. Birth control today is very widely available. It's generally very inexpensive, and so there's reason to not to I think to accept moral responsibility for those choices. Now, why have Christians traditionally been opposed to abortion? And now what I want to do is sort of lay out some of the principles that I think need to shape our approach to issues like abortion. The first conviction is this: human life, all human life is precious. It's precious not just because it's created by God, but it's precious because human beings are unique. They are different from animals, from dogs, from cats, other mammals. Human beings, unlike any other creature, are made in the image of God. They reflect the image of God. And so in that sense, human life has value and dignity and worth because it's created in the image of God. Well, the second conviction then kind of comes as I think a corollary to that, which is, when does human life begin? And that's actually for some, that's a more difficult question than you might think. Does it begin at conception? Does it begin when the heart begins to beat? Does it begin when the child is born? And if so, at what point in the process of giving birth is the child considered a child? Is it when it takes its first breath? So it raises issues, but the biblical conviction is actually that human life begins before birth. It begins at conception. Psalm 139 states this very well, where it says that you knit me together in my mother's womb. And so that's a poetic description of the fact that even before birth, God is the author of life. God is the one who brings together and creates and gives life. And so therefore, because God creates human life, and because God creates life before birth, and because God creates life to reflect the image of God, human life is valuable even at conception. And therefore, to take the life of another person is really an assault on the image of God. It's an assault on the image of God in another person. And so all forms of taking life actually violate that image of God. And therefore, Christians historically have been opposed to abortion. Now, I think there's more that Christians need to consider on these matters. Sometimes Christians can get we can become too reductionistic. There are other factors that I think as Christians we need to bring into the equation as we think about these things. The first is this: sometimes making laws rather hastily can have unintended consequences. So in the wake of the overturning of the Supreme Court decision in June, states quickly began making laws to outlaw abortion, and some of those laws I think were made probably in haste and not very well, because they end up having unintended consequences. They might, for example, make it difficult or even impossible for a doctor to perform a medically necessary abortion because of the restrictions that are placed on the doctor because of these laws. And so that's a factor that you have to consider. When you make these laws, are you making them in such a way that it allows for some of these more difficult and complicated and thorny issues? Are you allowing for, say, cases of rape and incest? That's a horrible experience, and I think there's room in the Christian conscience to allow for that. Maybe that's, in a perfect world you wouldn't, but I think under those difficult and horrible cases, there may be a way to allow for that and acknowledge that might be a case where an abortion is not maybe desirable but permissible. The other thing I think that Christians really need to take to heart is that it's not enough for us to be pro-birth. if you want to be pro-life, if you want to be pro-life in the fullest sense of the word, then you have to ensure that you aren't just advocating for the necessity of birth, right? But if you indeed believe that all life is precious and made in the image of God, Scripture also tells us that to neglect the poor and to be insensitive to their needs is also an assault on the image of God. And so if you protect the right of the unborn child because you want to defend the vulnerable and the weak and so on, then you also have to, I think, give consideration to how are you caring for women in a situation, in a low-income environment or a low-income family, where there's maybe a more likelihood for a person to seek an abortion. So, in other words, are you doing what you can to address the conditions that create situations where abortion is more likely to be in demand? In other words, what are you doing to address the needs of poverty, to address social needs and social concerns? And how are you caring for women who if a woman decides not to have an abortion and instead decides to carry out a pregnancy, are you then going to commit yourself to caring for that woman or to caring for women in that situation, to coming alongside of them, to mentoring them, to building relationships, to providing benevolent support so that they can have and raise this child, right? You can't just say, well, look, we've made it illegal for you to have an abortion, therefore you must have this child because this child is made in the image of God. Are you then also ensuring that you're doing what you can to support this woman? The other factor, I think, is that as Christians, we live in a pluralistic culture. And so it always takes some wisdom to sort out what exactly does that mean. Sometimes we're going to be, sometimes we have to accept that the laws may not encapsulate everything that we would want on an issue like this. Again, that's what I said when I talked about laws that permit abortion under cases of rape and incest. That may not be the ultimate, the greatest outcome, but it may be something that we can live with, because it would reduce the overall number of abortions. Still, a law that would make abortion illegal, but it would allow it under certain instances. That may get us closer to what is ultimately a good outcome and a better and more just society. It might not be it might not be perfection, it might not be the perfect solution, which would be to outlaw everything, but it might get us closer there as a society. And that owes to the fact that as Christians, we do live in a pluralistic society. We live in a society with a multiplicity of opinions and convictions and beliefs, and somehow all of those have to sort of come together, and we have to sort of learn to live together with all of that. And then finally, the other thing to think about is where are the fathers in all of this? I think that's an important question. I touched on it a couple minutes ago. Often this is seen as a question of women's health for obvious reasons, but I think that neglects the fact that fathers are also responsible here, and fathers should be held accountable. If they are the father of a child, they should be responsible then for doing what they need to do to support that child. If abortion is going to be made illegal, then what are the fathers doing, and how are they held accountable? How are they held financially responsible for their role as father? And I'm not sure exactly what that would look like, but I'm just sort of pointing that out, that some of this is a structural issue. It's the breakdown of family that's a part of this. And so as Christians, what are we doing to look at the whole picture? Maybe one final issue, and I'll just close with this. Many people who've experienced abortion, and I've talked to a number of them over the years, some oftentimes way back in their youth, many, many years ago, they live and they carry guilt with them for many years to come. That's not always something that's acknowledged. That's not always something that's brought out. Oftentimes today, abortion is looked at as something to celebrate, and yet it's not uncommon for many years later that sense of guilt to come in. And I think as Christians, the final principle that we have to hold on this is that of God's grace and mercy in Christ. There is no sin that is so great that God can't forgive it. And that's true in this case as well. And Christians hold out the message of the gospel, which which assures us that sin can be forgiven, that the worst things that we can do can be taken away, and that God, as our perfect Father, loves and adopts us into his family as his very own children. And sort of there's this reverse idea that God looks at us, the unwanted child, and he sees us in our condition of brokenness and fallenness and sin, and he comes alongside. And you can make the case that the gospel then is the picture of God losing his child in order to gain us, right? God losing and giving up Jesus so that we can be brought into his family. So there's the gospel is a beautiful picture of sort of the inverse of what the abortion issue is all about. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.